Walter had known Buck for about 10 years and had spent quite a bit of time in his bar, sipping beer and admiring the girls who worked there. They came and went, but all of them were attractive. The current trio was no exception. Gemma behind the bar and both waitresses, Riz and Cassidy, caught Walter's eye. However, if this was true for Gemma and Riz, it didn't quite describe his feelings towards Cassidy. Looking at her, Walter thought, why not marry someone like her instead of the one I'm married to? Cassidy possessed a unique allure. If Gemma and Riz were beautiful in a "I'm beautiful and I know it" way, Cassidy was different. Gemma and Riz could be acquaintances or friends, but Cassidy could be the one to spend a lifetime with. But no matter how much Walter wanted to get closer to any of these three girls, it couldn't happen. It couldn't because of who he was. Walter was one of those men who truly followed the principle of "till death do us part" when it came to love. And at the moment, this principle was hindering him greatly. Recently, Walter found out that his wife was having an affair with her boss, and it seemed that some of their mutual friends knew about it. Although he wondered if they were truly his friends. It seemed like real friends should have told him if they found out his wife was cheating on him. Walter thought they were probably more Adriana's friends than his. He sat, sipping beer and contemplating his unfaithful wife, when Vince Blackthorne settled on a bar stool next to him. "How are you, Wally?" Vince asked. "Hanging in there, Vince." "And you?" Walter replied. Same old, same old." "Will you be here tomorrow evening?" "Why?" "Open mic night tomorrow evening. We'll have some good guys performing." "Yes, but I'll have to endure all your silly jokes about blondes." "I see your wife's face when you tell them, and I wonder why she hasn't cut out your tongue in your sleep yet." "I don't sleep next to her," Vince replied. Walter found this strange, but before he could say anything, Vince added, "I need to talk to Buck about tomorrow night," and left. Gemma approached and asked if Walter wanted more beer, but he declined. He finished what was in front of him, stood up, and headed home. When Walter arrived home, Adriana had already prepared dinner and greeted him with hugs and kisses, to which he responded in kind. Adriana didn't know that Walter was aware of her secret life with the boss, and he didn't want her to find out about it until he sorted out all his affairs. Until then, he still wanted to lead a normal family life, so he had to keep his knowledge to himself. When Walter learned about Adriana's adventures, he turned to a lawyer and discovered the harsh truth that he wouldn't get anything in a divorce from Adriana. According to the lawyer, the only options were either to simply leave without divorcing Adriana and without telling her where he went, or to smile, accept the situation, and live with it. To accept and live with it? Easy to say when it's not happening to you, thought Walter. But in the end, he decided to do just that, live with it until he could improve his financial situation or leave Adriana on his own terms. His terms involved not giving her anything and leaving Hector Simmons bankrupt. It would be easier than pie to expose her boss. All he needed to do was tell his wife what he was up to, and if Walter understood her correctly, she wouldn't hesitate and would simply kick him out. Octavia Simmons was the only child of Benjamin Fitzpatrick, and he adored her, but he wasn't a fool. When his beloved daughter announced her intention to marry Hector Simmons, whom she met at her father's company Christmas party, Fitzpatrick insisted on a prenuptial agreement that would prevent Simmons from gaining control of Fitzpatrick Corp if anything happened to Fitzpatrick. Octavia was his sole heir, and he wanted to ensure she retained control of his estate. Walter knew all this thanks to Adriana, who worked as Simmons' secretary at Fitzpatrick Corp and was privy to all the office gossip. She brought these rumors home, and they became the topic of dinner conversations. When Fitzpatrick and his wife died in a plane crash, their only heir Octavia found herself in control of the company. Either she didn't think she could handle management, or she didn't want to, but Hector Simmons, the purchasing manager, suddenly became the company president. Octavia may not have wanted to run the company, but she acted wisely and retained the titles of CEO and chairman of the board to keep a close eye on Hector. All Walter had to do regarding Simmons was to tell his wife everything he knew. Adriana was promoted right after Simmons. She became the personal assistant to the company's president. This promotion both pleased and saddened Walter. The extra money pleased him because they had just bought a new house, new furniture, and household appliances. But the new job required Adriana to travel around the country with Simmons when he was negotiating new contracts. Adriana was absent for 2 to 3 days, 2 to 3 times a month. Walter wanted his wife to be by his side, not flying around the country, but Adriana was happy in her new job, so he kept silent and accepted the situation. That is, he accepted it until he and Adriana went dancing at the Axe Club. They had a great time, drinking, dancing, and socializing with friends. About 2 hours after the party started, Walter needed to use the restroom. He was sitting in one of the stalls, minding his own business, when Harold and Tommy walked in. Walter recognized them by their voices. Walter overheard Tommy saying, "Adriana looks very good today." "Yeah, I wouldn't mind having some fun with her," Harold replied. "I don't know if she can handle you. I thought maybe I could get her by threatening to tell Wally what she's up to on her trips with the boss." "I wouldn't do that. Wally is so fixated on her that he won't believe you. He might even punch you for daring to speak about her like that." Tommy was right. Walter wouldn't believe him. He knew his Adriana. She loved him as much as he loved her. His Adriana would never, under any circumstances, betray him. When Walter stepped out of the stall, he thought about going to those 2 idiots and punching them in the face for what they said about his wife. The other half said, "Don't be a fool. You'll only cause a scene and put Adriana in an awkward position." Reason prevailed, and Walter returned to the party, trying to enjoy the evening. When the party ended, he and Adriana went home and made love. As they embraced afterwards, Walter realized that his wife could never betray him. But human nature is a strange thing. It makes us prove something to ourselves. Someone says, "You can't do it," and you have to prove that you can. Someone says, "It's simply impossible," and you have to prove that it is possible. Someone says, "Your wife is cheating on you," and you have to prove that it's not true. And the simplest way to prove it? Show up where she is during one of her trips and see for yourself that it's a blatant lie. And that's exactly what Walter did. Simons and Adriana went to Atlanta, and as usual, Adriana called Walter to let him know where they were staying. Walter was on the next flight to Atlanta. At the hotel check-in desk, Walter asked if his wife had checked in, and after showing his ID, he was informed that she was in room 405. He mentioned that she had come to Atlanta to meet her cousin and inquired if he had checked in. Indeed, cousin Jimmy was staying in room 710. Walter was already heading to the phone in the lobby to call Adriana's room when he accidentally glanced at the elevators. He saw Adriana and Simons stepping out of the elevator, holding hands. They were smiling at each other. They stopped and kissed as the elevator doors closed behind them, then headed to the hotel bar. Walter saw enough to understand that what he had overheard was true, and all he needed to do was turn around, go home, and figure out what to do next. But then human nature intervened. It told him, "You need to find out more, Walter." He couldn't just follow them to the bar because they would notice him, so he needed to change his appearance enough not to attract their attention. Walter entered the hotel souvenir shop. There were many items with Atlanta Hawks logos, and he bought a baseball cap, a windbreaker, a tote bag with the team's logo, and cheap sunglasses. He grabbed a copy of Time magazine and headed to the public restroom. The suit and tie went into the bag. Walter put on the cap and windbreaker and headed to the bar. Of course, the disguise was not very convincing and wouldn't withstand close scrutiny, but Walter didn't expect Adriana or Simons to scrutinize anyone. They clearly didn't expect to see him in Atlanta, and judging by how they were holding hands and kissing in public, they were unlikely to be thinking about private detectives or sleuths. Walter noticed them as soon as he entered the bar. They were sitting in a booth, drinks in front of them, kissing. He sat at a table where he could see them, ordered a drink, and pretended to read a magazine. They had 2 cocktails each, kissed for a while, and about half an hour later, they got up and left the bar. They walked past Walter without even looking at him. He waited a minute, then stood up and followed them. Walter watched as they, holding hands, approached the elevator, got in, and went up. He didn't stop on the 4th floor so Adriana could get out and go to her room. The elevator reached the 7th floor, stopped for a minute, and then went down. On the way back, it also did not stop on the 4th. Convinced of his wife's betrayal, Walter headed home. The next day, he met with the lawyer and began to take action to put an end to his relationship with Adriana. When Walter returned from work on Thursday, he didn't even stop by home. Adriana called him and said that she had a morning meeting with Simmons in New York, so they would fly there from Atlanta, but she would return home the next day. Walter went to Sweet Life to have a couple of bottles of beer and check if Vince was right when he said that some good guys were gathering for an open mic night. He sat on a bar stool, ordered his usual beer, and settled in comfortably. As usual, Vince started the evening with a joke about blondes. 2 blondes were in an elevator. Long before they reached their floor, the elevator stopped and a very handsome guy entered. He smiled at the blondes, reached out his hand, and pressed the button for the next floor. Then he stood up and admired the view as the elevator went up. When the door opened behind him, he smiled at the blondes, turned around, and left. As he turned to leave, the blondes saw a lot of dandruff on his back. The first blonde turned to the second and said, "Look." The second blonde replied, "It's okay. If I can get him home, I'll give him head and shoulders." The first blonde looked at the second and asked, "But how do you do the shoulders?" Vince elicited laughter from everyone except his wife. She just sat at her table at the back of the room and threw disapproving glances at him. He stepped forward and introduced the next aspiring comedian. The guy who took the stage looked around the crowd and began. 2 boys were arguing when the teacher walked into the room. The teacher asked them why they were arguing, and the first boy said, "We found a $10 bill and decided to give it to whoever can tell the biggest lie." "You should be ashamed," said the teacher. "When I was your age, I didn't even know what a lie was." The 2 boys looked at each other, nodded, and handed the $10 to the teacher. Walter politely chuckled, then continued to scan the room. Just watching people, when Cassidy took a seat next to him. "Hey, handsome, care to buy a poor working girl a drink?" she asked. Walter caught Gemma's attention and pointed to Cassidy. Gemma nodded, and a moment later placed a screwdriver in front of Cassidy. "And what do I owe the pleasure of your company?" he asked. "Nothing, just curious." "Curious? About what?" "Not what, but who." "You." "Me? You must be joking." "Why would I? You are attractive and a good guy." "Ha ha. Funny. But why? You often come here, and I can tell by the way you look at Gemma, Tina, and me, that you like what you see. But you are not like many others who come here. You keep your hands to yourself and do not make indecent or suggestive comments. The question is, why haven't you made a move on any of us yet?" "You know why, Cassidy. I am married." "Why? Why are you married to that loose woman? Don't you know she's cheating on you?" This caught Walter off guard, and Cassidy noticed the expression on his face. "You didn't know? How could you not know?" "Everyone else does," Cassidy said. "How do you know?" Walter asked. She pointed and said, "See that guy sitting in the corner with red hair? That's my brother Will. He works at Fitzpatrick's. Everyone there knows about your wife and Simmons. Will came in here once and saw you sitting here, and me approaching you. He later told me he feels sorry for you. And when I asked him why, he told me. What I can't understand is why. If everyone knows, why didn't anyone bother to tell me?" Walter said. "I don't know, maybe for various reasons. There are so-called open marriages these days. There are those who love you too much to hurt you. And there are those who, perhaps, don't love you very much and are glad this is happening to you. There are also people who may love you, but love your wife more." She finished her cocktail and said, "Break time is over. I need to get back to work." Walter watched her leave and wondered if she would agree to go on a date with him once he gets rid of Adriana. On stage, Vince announced that it was now time for those who wanted to test their skills. And a voice from the depths of the hall said, "I would like to try." Everyone in the room, including Vince, was surprised when his blonde wife Alicia stood up and headed towards the stage. Vince looked stunned as he handed the microphone to his wife. "I know my idiot husband loves to tell jokes about blondes," looking right at me. "But have you noticed that Vince is also a blonde?" "It's time for payback, dear husband," Alicia began. Alicia started her performance. An Irishman, a Mexican, and a blonde were working on the construction scaffolding on the 20th floor of a building. They were having lunch, and the Irishman said, "Corned beef and cabbage again. If I get salo with cabbage for lunch again, I'll jump off this building," said the Irishman. The Mexican opened his lunchbox and exclaimed, "Another burrito. If I get one more burrito, I'll jump too." The blonde opened his lunch and said, "Bologna again. If I get another bologna sandwich, I'll jump too." The next day, the Irishman opened his lunch, saw salo with cabbage, and jumped to his death. The Mexican opened his lunch, saw the burrito, and jumped off the woods. The blonde opened his lunch, saw bologna again, and also jumped to his death. At the Irishman's funeral, his wife cried. She said, "If I had known how tired he was of salo with cabbage, I would never have given it to him again." The Mexican's wife also cried and said, "I could have given him tacos or enchiladas. I didn't know he hated burritos so much." Everyone turned to look at the blonde's wife, and she said, "Don't look at me, he packed his own lunch." She laughed and continued, "What do you call a blonde with an IQ of 35? Gifted. Why don't blondes eat more M&Ms? They're hard to peel. And finally, how are blondes different from government bonds? Bonds mature over time." Alicia received applause from the women in the audience and their male companions who wanted to stay in their lady's good graces. Usually, when the comedian finished his performance, Vince would come out, take the microphone, and ask if anyone else wanted to give it a try. If no one did, Vince would tell a couple more jokes about blondes, thank everyone for coming, and wish everyone a good night. But this time, that didn't happen. When Vince still didn't come out, Alicia placed the microphone on the floor and returned to her table with her friends. Finally, Vince came back on stage. Leaning down to pick up the microphone, he muttered, "Bitch," unaware that the microphone was sensitive enough to pick it up. Silence fell in the room. When Vince brought the microphone to his mouth and said, "That's all for today, guys," there were no usual applause and cheers. Walter stood up and went home. For the next 3 months, he pretended to be a loving husband to a woman who pretended to love him in return. Walter received a few orders and one bonus check, which he cashed and hid the money in a safe that Adriana didn't know about. The amount was small, around $10,000, and it wasn't enough to support him after the divorce, when he would have to give half of all his belongings. And then luck smiled upon Walter. Like many others, he bought lottery tickets, crossed his fingers, and began to dream. He was lucky to buy a winning Powerball ticket. 4 numbers matched. There was the Powerball and Power Play, so the ticket brought him $40,000 before taxes. Ultimately, when cashing the check, it would have brought him around $28,200. It wouldn't make him rich, but it would be enough to start a new life after Adriana. He had 6 months to cash the ticket, so he needed to finalize the divorce before receiving the money. Otherwise, it would become part of the property they would divide between themselves. The timing was right. Adriana had just received a promotion, and her salary was slightly higher than Walter's, so alimony was not anticipated. He would have to pay legal fees, and there was no way around that unless somehow he could get Adriana to file for divorce herself, but Walter didn't see how that could happen. The biggest problem, as he saw it, was that Adriana could contest the divorce. In that case, she could drag the case out until it was time to cash the ticket, and then it would just become another one of their assets subject to a 50-50 split. Walter needed to find a way to get Adriana not to resist. As far as he knew, she might not resist, but he needed to make sure somehow. He could file a lawsuit citing infidelity, but that didn't matter. Even if he accused her of infidelity, Adriana could laugh at him and say he had no evidence, that it was all in his imagination, and that they needed to undergo family therapy to figure out where his insecurity came from, and then solve that problem. Walter really had no evidence. Just saying, "Well, everyone knows," wasn't proof, nor was seeing Adriana with Simmons holding hands and kissing. He needed solid audio and video evidence to assert this, evidence he could lay on the table in front of Adriana so she understood she would really get a divorce, and that she would spend her time trying to fight to stay together. He needed some kind of solid evidence, but after talking to several private detective agencies, he realized he couldn't afford to get them even with the help of detectives. That evening at Sweet Life, the open mic was on again, and Walter had a couple of drinks before heading home to Adriana. She was away again. Cassidy sat down on the chair next to him and uttered her usual phrase, "Would you buy a poor working girl a drink?" She did this every time he came. Walter smiled and waved Gemma over, and she approached with a drink for Cassidy in hand. It seemed they were falling into their usual routine. "You seem a bit quiet today, Wally." "It doesn't look like you're having much fun," Cassidy remarked. "I have a lot on my mind, Cass," Walter replied. "Like what?" she asked. Walter was in just the mood to lay it all out to her. He told her about his situation with Adriana, about not being able to afford hiring a detective. Cassidy shrugged. "I don't think it's such a big problem. Since you can't afford it, just find someone who can." "What?" Walter didn't understand. "You said you don't think his wife knows, right? So go and tell her. Let her unleash her dogs on those two cheaters. She'll catch them, divorce that idiot, and call your wife the husband's mistress. Everything will become public, and it won't cost you a penny." Walter laughed and said, "I've been thinking about it, but you crystallized that thought. Thank you." The next day, he called Octavia Simmons, reminded her of who he was, and asked to talk. She asked about what, and he said it concerned a situation that involved both of them and was too delicate to discuss over the phone. She agreed to meet him for lunch at the Verdi restaurant at noon. Walter arrived 10 minutes early, told Sam he was expecting a guest, described her, and then took a table in the back of the room. Mrs. Simmons appeared right at 12, settled across from Walter, and immediately got down to business. "What situation did you want to talk about?" she asked directly. Walter, while waiting for her arrival, pondered on how best to start the conversation and still didn't have a clear idea until she sat down. Her direct approach settled it all for him. He went straight to the point. "Your husband and my wife are having an affair, and quite a long one, I'm afraid." "You can't be serious," Octavia replied, visibly shocked. "I'm afraid I'm absolutely serious," Walter confirmed. "Do you have any evidence?" she asked, slightly regaining her composure. "Only what I've seen with my own eyes." "You actually saw them?" "Not the act itself, but I saw enough to be convinced." "I don't understand. You saw them, but you didn't see them?" Walter explained how he found out what they were up to, how he went to Atlanta, and what he saw there. "I admit, this is not something a court would accept as evidence, but I have no doubt about what happened after they took the elevator to the 9th floor." "I wouldn't have any doubts either if I had seen it," Octavia agreed. "What are you going to do?" "Get a divorce as soon as I can." "Thank you for informing me about this." "I have 2 reasons to tell you about what's going on," Walter continued. "Firstly, I genuinely thought you should know. And secondly, Octavia prompted him. "Mainly out of selfish reasons. The divorce will go much smoother if Adriana doesn't put up a fight, but I think without substantial evidence, she will contest it. The problem is, I don't have substantial evidence. I considered hiring a private detective to get this evidence, but I concluded that I couldn't afford it." "But you can." Octavia looked closely at Walter and then said, "And then, as a form of revenge, you'll suggest having fun, and then let them know that we'll have the last laugh?" Walter laughed at this and replied, "Be serious, Mrs. Simons. No one will believe that a woman like you would get into bed with a guy like me, even to get back at her husband. Moreover, if we do that and let them know, it will undermine what I'm trying to achieve. It will give Adriana something she can use for a countersuit, and the divorce will drag on. I want to get rid of this traitor as soon as possible." "I think this will also affect me," Octavia said thoughtfully. "Well, then let's just chalk it up to what could have been, and move on with our lives," Walter suggested. When Walter returned home, Adriana was there. Over dinner, they discussed how their day had gone. Both still played the roles of loving spouses, so they settled on the couch and watched TV until bedtime, then went to bed. Walter didn't know if Adriana considered this lovemaking or not. Tuesday repeated Monday, and Walter expected Wednesday to repeat both Monday and Tuesday. But at noon on Wednesday, Adriana called him and said that she and her boss needed to be in New York on Thursday morning. So they were flying out at 4 p.m., and she wouldn't be home in the evening. Therefore, Walter did what he usually did when Adriana wasn't home on Wednesdays. He went to Sweet Life. He stayed late at work and, as a result, arrived there after the start of the open mic night. Therefore, he missed Vince's jokes about blondes. Gemma brought Walter a bottle of PBR, and he noticed the scene. He looked at the table where Vince's wife usually sat and saw that she wasn't there. As far as he remembered, she never missed open mic nights. Walter pondered whether this was related to what happened last Wednesday. The guy on stage was a regular, but Walter had never seen him perform before. He started his act and joked quite amusingly. Walter politely chuckled, then heard, "Buy a drink for the poor worker," and turned to see Cassidy had taken a seat next to him. Before he could say a word, Gemma was already placing a drink in front of Cassidy. Walter surprised himself when he grabbed Cassidy and kissed her firmly. "Oh, what's this all of a sudden?" she exclaimed. "I followed your advice and contacted Octavia Simmons. She didn't know her dear husband was fooling around behind her back. I'm sure she'll investigate, but not sure if she'll share what she finds with me. Although it doesn't matter. As you said, when she divorces him, it will become public knowledge, and I can use that to my advantage. And all I get for this advice is a kiss?" Cassidy asked with feigned indignation. "What else would you want instead?" Walter inquired. "Ask me again when your divorce is finalized," she replied with a smile. Walter gazed at her for a long moment, then said, "You can count on it." Cassidy smiled, finished her drink, and returned to work. When Walter returned home from work on Thursday, Adriana was home, and dinner was almost ready. As he entered, she asked, "Dinner first or dessert?" "Dinner first," Walter replied. "If I start with dessert, we might never get to dinner, and it would be a shame to waste it." "I remember when you always chose dessert first," Adriana remarked with a slight smile. "And I remember when you weren't a cheater," Walter thought, but said aloud, "I was much younger then and didn't understand the need for food to sustain strength and endurance." After dinner, they settled on the couch and watched TV before heading to bed. The following week passed without any trips, but Adriana worked late and had to go in for half a day on Saturday. Octavia Simmons called Walter on Tuesday and asked to meet him for lunch at the Verdi restaurant. When he arrived, she was already there, sitting at a table in the back row. On the table in front of her lay a large envelope, and she pushed it towards Walter when he sat down. "Here is everything you could ask for, and even more," Octavia said. "You already know she's cheating on you, so if I were you, I wouldn't look at the discs. These images will probably stay in your memory." Walter nodded without touching the envelope. "He's in for a big surprise when I hand this to him," Octavia continued. "My investigator found out that dear Hector rented an apartment to use as a love nest. If he had registered it in his name, my investigator wouldn't have had the legal right to set up audio and video surveillance there. But he messed up by not registering it in his name, instead billing the company. Since he billed the company, and I am an employee of the company, I could authorize it, which I did." "Let me guess," Walter said. "Tuesday and Thursday when Adriana told me she needed to work late, and Saturday when she said she had to go to work for half a day?" "You guessed right," Octavia confirmed. "And on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, long lunches." Walter was surprised they didn't do anything on Sunday to perfectly end the week. "Now that you have evidence, what are you going to do?" Octavia asked. "I'll hire a lawyer and file for divorce," Walter replied. "Use mine. He has already prepared all the documents," Octavia offered. "I plan for my hubby to receive a summons at work just before I demote him to the position he held before I married him. If we do everything right, we can file simultaneously," she added. "Give me your lawyer's number, and I'll call him as soon as I get back to the office." "I thought so. That's why I told him to expect your call," Octavia replied. "One more thing," she continued. "Because they discussed what to do after they finished their business, I'm going to serve him with a restraining order at the same time as the divorce papers. You should consider doing the same." "Why? What were they talking about?" Walter asked anxiously. Octavia took a deep breath and replied, "They were talking about how it would be easier for them if you and I were no longer around. Hector said that if I die, the marriage contract will be annulled, and he will be left with nothing. Your wife laughed and said that if you die, it will only bring her 100,000. 200,000 if your death is accidental. And then she asked if he had any ideas on how they could arrange it." Walter paled. "And what did he say?" "He said it's worth considering," Octavia said grimly. From the tone of their voices, I could tell they were just joking, but that gave me another reason to corner him. "My problem is," Walter continued, "I don't think I can stand in front of the judge at the hearing and say I fear for my life without bursting into laughter." "She was lying anyway," Octavia remarked. "I only have a $25,000 life insurance policy, but I agree with you, so I'll have something to strike her with." "Do you have any vacation days?" Octavia suddenly asked. 3 weeks. "Why?" "I thought that the day after I demote Hector, I could appoint you as the new company president," Octavia suggested with a sly smile. Of course, it would be just a fiction, but imagine his reaction to the fact that the woman's husband, whom he was having an affair with, becomes his new boss. "He will be furious," Walter agreed. "You could even pretend to be building a case against him to have him fired." Octavia pondered for a moment. "Why not just fire him instead of demoting him?" "He will probably sue the company for wrongful termination," Walter replied. "What wrongful termination?" Octavia retorted. "The apartment he pays for with company money is misappropriation of corporate funds for personal use. His affair with a married colleague under his direct supervision exposes the company to the risk of harassment lawsuits if he gets tired of Adriana and kicks her out, and she gets angry enough to try to retaliate. All this, plus the fact that he's cheating on me, shows that he is not trustworthy, and a company cannot be run by someone who is not trustworthy." Walter nodded, impressed by her logic. "Take all this to your lawyer and see what he says. The downside of this argument is that you'll have to leave Adriana, although you probably want to rip her hair out," he added. "Why should I leave her?" Octavia wondered. "Because of the potential harassment accusation. She just needs to say that your husband threatened to fire her and give her a bad reference if she didn't agree. You'll leave her, give her a small raise, and promote her to the worst position in the company. After a while, she'll get tired of the lousy job and quit on her own." Walter glanced at the clock. "I need to get back to work." "Thank you for this," he said, holding the envelope in front of him as he stood up. "And what about my idea of making you the president for a few weeks?" Octavia asked as Walter was getting ready to leave. "It won't work if you fire him, and he won't be in place," Walter replied. "Maybe I just want you around to get to know you better," Octavia said with a slight smile. "We can discuss this when we have more time," Walter replied. "You have my number, will you call?" On his way to work, Walter pondered Octavia's words about wanting to get to know him better. He decided he would call her, but only to discuss the divorce and the timeline for filing lawsuits against their unfaithful spouses. "How can we get to know each other better?" he thought. No, she was steak, lobster, and champagne, and I was Diet Cola, a burger, and fries. It just won't work. Returning to the office, Walter called the lawyer whose number Octavia had given him, and found out that the lawyer was expecting his call. They talked, and the lawyer said that all the documents were ready. He just needed to copy them and insert Walter's data instead of Octavia's. He named the price, and Walter gave him his credit card number. The lawyer said the documents would be ready for signing the next day, and Walter agreed to meet him at 4 o'clock to sign the papers. As Walter lay down to sleep, Adriana kissed him and whispered, "I love you," before falling asleep. Walter lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she really meant it, and if so, why she was cheating on him. These thoughts haunted him until he drifted off to sleep. At 4 o'clock, Walter entered the office of Mahoney, Rupert, and Joe, and was led to Michael Joe's office. He was surprised to see Octavia there, and it turned out that signing his documents was only part of the reason for his presence. It was also a meeting to plan the strategy. The question was when to file for divorce for the spouses considering this decision. Due to the deadline with the lottery ticket, Walter wanted to do it as soon as possible, but Octavia wanted to wait for the right moment. In her opinion, the right moment was when the couple was on one of their trips. Why is it so important that you can't wait a week or two? Octavia finally asked. Walter opened his mouth to answer her, but then closed it. He was not a lawyer and did not know the law and could be mistaken. But it could be that hiding assets was illegal, and his lawyer would not allow him to do that, he said. It's just important to me, that's all, he said. With that, the meeting ended, and the case was postponed while Octavia figured out when Hector and Adriana would set off again. There was a cafe on the ground floor of the building, and as they exited the elevator, Octavia offered Walter to have a cup of coffee with her. They got coffee and sat down at a table. Octavia took a sip of her coffee and said, "All right, Walter, spill it." "Spill what?" asked Walter, pretending not to understand. "It was obvious that you were going to tell us why you were in such a hurry to hand over the documents to your wife, but then you changed your mind. So, tell me what's going on." Walter sighed and told her about the lottery ticket, its expiration date, and why he suddenly decided not to inform Joe about it. Octavia laughed and said, "No problem, Walter. Just give me the ticket. I'll buy it from you and cash it in." "I can't do that," replied Walter. "Why not?" Octavia wondered. "Think about why you came to me in the first place. You couldn't afford to hire a private detective, but I could. You knew I could because I'm wealthy. I'm still wealthy, Walter, and what's the point of wealth if you can't use it to get what you want? I want Hector to receive the documents as I described in Joe's office. To get what I want, I use my wealth. Furthermore," she added with a smile, "you'll also benefit if I buy your ticket. I'll give you $40,000 in cash, and you can put it in a safe or under the mattress, and you won't pay any state or federal taxes." Walter pondered for a moment. "But you'll end up paying taxes in the end." Octavia shook her head. "I'll give the ticket to my accountant, and by the time the taxes are paid, it will dissolve into the general mass and won't cost even 10 cents. Again, Walter, I'm simply using my wealth to get what I want." Walter shrugged and agreed. He didn't know how she did it, but 2 days later she gave him $40,000 in cash, which he deposited into his bank safe deposit box. Octavia got what she wanted, and it all happened just as she envisioned. Adriana and Hector stepped out of the elevator into the lobby of the Atlanta Marriott Hotel, smiling and holding hands. The smiles disappeared when a pretty blonde, chewing gum, approached them and handed each of them an envelope, informing them that the documents had been delivered to them. Adriana looked at the envelope in her hand and burst into tears. Hector's face twisted in disgust. He tried to tear the envelope in half but couldn't because it was too thick. He threw it on the floor, kicked it, and the envelope slid across the floor into the elevator just before the door closed. Adriana collapsed into one of the chairs in the lobby and sobbed into her hands. Hector looked at her with disgust and walked into the bar. A few minutes later, Adriana took out her mobile phone from her purse and spent the next 10 minutes trying to reach someone. When no one answered, she finally gave up, threw the phone on the floor, and started crying again. Walter, watching this scene on the video Octavia had taken, felt sadness despite everything. He still loved Adriana and had feelings for her. Seeing her suffer was hard. But her betrayal overshadowed any sympathy. When Adriana returned home, she found that Walter had changed the locks and couldn't get in. He allowed her to ring the doorbell and knock for 15 minutes before opening the door. "Adriana, did you not read all the papers in the envelope you were given? Did you not see the restraining order that requires you to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, workplace, and any other place I may be? Leave now before I call the police and they come to arrest you. You can't treat me like this, Walter." "This is my home too," Adriana replied with a trembling voice. "The judge who signed the order doesn't think so, Adriana. Now leave before I call the police." "Damn it, Walter, you have to let me talk to you." "You have to let me explain," Adriana pleaded. "No, Adriana, that incident with the disease you passed on to me said it all." Walter lied and slammed the door in her face. Of course, it was a lie. She didn't infect him with a venereal disease, but she didn't know that. And Walter hoped the thought of it would torment her until she got tested. 5 minutes later, Adriana was still knocking on the door, and Walter called the police. A car arrived with 2 officers. Walter showed them his ID, and they told Adriana she had to leave. She tried to argue with them until they finally told her to leave and stay away, or they would arrest her. She cast a disapproving glance at the house and left. Walter waited 2 days, then called her and said he would meet her at the Buck Tavern to let her talk. They met, and he listened to what he expected to hear. "I did it for us," Adriana said through tears. "I did it because the money would help pay off our debts. And as soon as that was done, I planned to leave. I love only you, and with Simons, it was just sex, and he wasn't great. You are much better than him. We can get through this because we love each other. Just give me a chance." Walter listened to her, then expressed his opinion. "Just sign the papers and send them, Adriana. If you sign, the videos of you and that scumbag will never reach your family and friends. You will never have your own website, and they will never appear on thousands of amateur sites where I could send copies. Just sign and be done with it." He paused, looking into her eyes. "After watching the video of you and your lover, those scenes are etched in my memory and will never disappear as long as you are around, reminding me of them. It's over between us, Adriana. Accept it and move on with your life." "Damn it, Walter, I don't want a divorce. I love you," exclaimed Adriana. "Then you shouldn't have started cheating on me," Walter replied coldly. "Now you are used and tainted goods, and I don't want anything to do with you. Consider yourself lucky. At least you still have a job, which can't be said about your lover." Walter stood up, leaving Adriana alone and smiling to himself. He knew that when she was ready to leave, she would find out that he hadn't paid the bill, and she would have to deal with it herself. 3 days later, Octavia called Walter and asked to meet for lunch. They met at Verdi restaurant, and after Tilly took their order, Octavia told him what happened after delivering the documents to Hector. Apparently, he never found the envelope he dropped in the elevator, so he never read the restraining order, Octavia began. "When he returned home, he couldn't get in because I changed the locks. He started banging on the front door, kicking it, and shouting, 'Get your ass over here and open the damn door.'" Walter grimaced, imagining the scene. Apparently, he didn't notice the car parked outside with the sign Avery Security Service. Octavia continued. 2 people got out of the car, approached him, and politely asked him to leave. He told them to go to hell and demanded they get off his property. One of the men told Hector that they were hired to guard the territory and ensure he complied with the restraining order, instructing him to stay 500 feet away from the house and Mrs. Simmons. "And how did he react?" asked Walter. "He insulted them again and ordered them to leave his property once more. When they didn't move, he pushed one of them. When Hector regained consciousness after being stunned with a taser, he found out that the 2 guards had been replaced by 2 police officers, and he himself was in handcuffs. When he came out of isolation and went to work, 2 guards stopped him, telling him they were ordered not to let him into the building beyond the lobby. One of the guards made a call. 3 minutes later, the HR manager appeared and informed Hector that he was fired for misappropriation of company funds and violation of the company's policy and procedures manual's moral section. "You can't treat me like this, idiots. You seem to have forgotten that I'm the boss here," Octavia quoted Simmons, mimicking his voice. He raged, and when he refused to leave, the HR employee called the police. They arrived, and the fool ended up back in isolation for violating the restraining order a second time. Walter shook his head as he listened to this. And how did it all end? He didn't know I was in the building, so when he was brought before the judge, the same as the first time, he managed to fend off the charges because there was no way he could have known I was there. I don't have an office in the building, and I'm not one of the regular employees, so he had no reason to think I might be there. The judge agreed and released him. But it was humiliating for him to be escorted out of the building in handcuffs in front of people he once led. One of them was Adriana. Octavia continued her story. As the chair of the board of directors, I took on the responsibilities of the president and informed Adriana that I didn't need a personal assistant and that she would work in the secretariat until another position was found for her. She would keep her salary and all other privileges she had as a personal assistant. Octavia paused and added with a slight smile. And then I told her that I actually wanted to fire her, and the only reason I didn't do it was because you talked me out of it. How did she react? Walter asked with interest. Adriana seemed shocked that I even know you, let alone have any contact with you, Octavia replied. The next day, I called her into my office and informed her that she was being promoted to the position of office manager and being sent to a factory located 30 miles from here. Then I told Adriana that she would receive a 10% salary increase so that she would earn a little more than you, sparing you from having to pay alimony. Walter raised his eyebrows in surprise. And what did you tell her at the end of the meeting? I told her that after our divorces are finalized, I intend to scratch your eyes out in gratitude for informing me that my husband was cheating on me, Octavia smirked. Adriana left the meeting in shock, shaking her head. Walter was confident that Adriana believed him when he told her about the potential consequences with the videos he had, as she did not contest the divorce. It was a standard split of assets, and all he had to pay, besides Adriana, was the loss of the house. He had not lived there long, so the proceeds from the sale were modest but enough to make the down payment for an apartment and move there. Adriana rented an apartment close to her new job. She still called him at least once a week, asking for another chance. He always replied, "Thank you for the offer, but I refuse." The day after the divorce was finalized, Octavia called him and asked when his divorce would be over. "My divorce was finalized yesterday," he replied. "Mine will be today. Do you have any plans for tomorrow?" "No, I have no plans," he said. "You do. Pick me up at 6 o'clock in the evening from my office. We'll celebrate freedom with dinner, drinks, and dancing." Octavia looked stunning when he picked her up at 6 o'clock in the evening. She said she asked him to pick her up from the office because there were people there who remained on good terms with Hector, and they would probably tell him that they were together. The same people would likely inform his ex-wife as well. The dinner conversation was engaging. Octavia talked about how things have been since she took over the company. She realized she loved being in charge and regretted not taking on responsibilities when her father passed away. Walter told her about his affairs and the apartment he bought after the house was sold. After dinner, they went to Red Corn for drinks and dancing. On Saturday, Walter and Octavia woke up late and went to Minotaur for a late breakfast, then headed to his apartment and once again made love. On Sunday, they spent the night at Octavia's again. The following week, Walter and Octavia saw each other 2 or 3 times a week and on weekends. Then on Friday evening, while they were spending the weekend at his house, she told him that this weekend would be their last. "I have enjoyed every minute spent with you, but I do not love you. And honestly, you do not love me either. We are good friends united by a common cause and trauma, but that's all we have and will have, and a relationship cannot be built on that," she said. "Have you recently come to this realization?" Walter asked. "A couple of days ago." "Deep down, you also understand that these relationships have no future," Octavia firmly stated. "We could give it a try. Only to end up disappointed in each other, like in partners," Octavia said firmly. Walter had nothing to say. Eventually, he too realized that he did not see a future with Octavia. On Sunday, they said goodbye and decided to remain friends. And on Monday, Walter began a new phase of his life as a bachelor seeking love. On Monday and Tuesday, Walter was feeling a bit down due to losing Octavia. But by Wednesday, his mood had improved because he had not been to Sweet Life in the last month and a half and finally decided to go there. As soon as he sat on a stool at the bar counter, Gemma appeared with his PBR and sat on the opposite side of the bar counter. "Welcome back, stranger," she said. "Nice to be back, dear. Can I persuade you to agree to a date with me tonight?" He asked. "You know I don't date clients," she said. "But there is a young lady here who might agree to give you a chance." And she walked away to attend to another client. Walter had already drunk half of his beer when Vince sat next to him. "Where have you been, Walter?" he asked. "Were our talented guys not impressive enough for you, so you decided not to come back?" No, he replied. "I just had something to take care of." "Ah, I see," said Vince. He stood up to talk to other participants of tonight's event, then went up on stage, greeted everyone at the open mic night, and predictably started with a joke about blondes. A blonde buys a thermos. She brings it to work to show her friends. One of her friends, also a blonde, asks, "What does it do?" The first blonde answers, "He keeps warm things warm and cold things cold." Her friend asks, "What's in there now?" "A cup of coffee and 2 ice creams." In the middle of the evening, someone sat on the stool next to him, and he heard a familiar voice, "Buy a drink for a poor worker?" As always, as soon as she uttered these words, Gemma was already placing a drink on the bar in front of Cassidy. "Remember what I said about Walter's chance?" she said to him before leaving to attend to another customer. "What did she mean?" Cassidy asked. "I think she meant that since I'm divorced, I should ask you out on a date." "So what?" she asked. "What are my chances of you agreeing?" "I don't know until you ask." "Would you have dinner with me on your next day off?" "No. I can't have dinner with you on my next day off, but I'm free on the second day." And she took a napkin, wrote something on it, and handed it to him. "Call me to make arrangements." She got up, smiled, and went back to work. Since Walter had just finished his 3rd beer, he decided it was time to leave. He arrived at Cassidy's door at 6 o'clock on Monday, and as he pressed the doorbell, he thought about what lay ahead. We hope you liked the story. Please show us your support by clicking the like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon to receive notifications about new stories.